Justin, welcome to Washington Times Higher Ground. Now, you have a new book, a new podcast. We're going to get into the podcast in a bit. It sort of comes off of your book, but the book title is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And that's an interesting title in light of where we are culturally right now. Tell us a little bit about this book project.
Well, the book really came about because I'd had a history of conversations between Christians and atheists. I hosted for many years a show called Unbelievable. And it was really born in the heyday of the new atheism, this very anti-God movement led by people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, who all had anti-God bestsellers in the mid-2000s. And that really kind of set off a whole movement online and in person where a lot of people found, really got on this bandwagon of being very anti-religious and saying essentially, God doesn't exist and religion is bad for you. So I was kind of very much in the middle of those discussions and debates, hosting some high-profile atheists opposite Christian thinkers back in the day. But what I noticed in the last several years, Billy, was that the conversations were changing in tone and substance quite dramatically. So fewer and fewer people were actually aligning themselves with the new atheists, even if they might be non-believers. They were saying, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. And I was noticing as an observer from the sidelines that the new atheist movement itself was sort of fracturing and splintering and unraveling in various interesting ways as well. And at the same time, I noticed a lot of the people I was now bringing on the show who, again, weren't Christians, but were actually quite open to the value of Christianity. They weren't dismissing it in the way that the new atheists had. So that would include people like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland. These were secular thinkers, but who were kind of reassessing the value of Christianity and saying, well, maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater too quickly. Maybe we need some kind of a story to make sense of life. And maybe atheism hasn't actually provided that. So that's really at the center of the book. It's this new phenomenon that I've kind of termed the surprising rebirth of belief in God, where even though, at one level, you look at the statistics around church going and Christianity, and you say fewer and fewer people are going, fewer and fewer people claiming the name of Christianity. That doesn't tell the whole story. There's something else going on in our culture, perhaps a little bit further upstream, if you like. And I think actually we might be surprised at the fact that Christianity could be set to come back again in interesting ways. I think it already is in interesting ways. So that's really what the book's about.
Yeah, I mean, you said so much there. I mean, I think it's interesting looking at the numbers because what we're seeing right now statistically are numbers that show us the end result of the last 10, 20 years of cultural behavior, right? That people have sort of been sold this narrative that, you can kind of do whatever you want, whatever you feel. And that's the current cultural paradigm. But it does feel like there are a lot of people, especially young people right now here in America, I know in the West in general, who are waking up and they're feeling like, wait a minute, this isn't true, right? This isn't working. I'm not finding fulfillment in that. And so we're seeing these revivals, these little pockets of, mass baptisms. These stories are happening, and it's not just anecdotal now. They're happening pretty frequently. You're hearing churches say, look, we just baptized the biggest number of people we've baptized in our history. And so that's a snapshot, I think, of what's going on. But I do want to go back to one other thing you were saying in the beginning there about Richard Dawkins and some of these others. One of the dynamics I have found really interesting is that Dawkins seems to be lining up with Christians on a variety of issues, a variety of social issues, the transgender issue, for instance. What do you make of that? Because that's strange.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways in which the ground has shifted a lot, politically, ideologically, over the last several years. And this is one of the interesting trends that I note in the book and in this new podcast, is that a lot of thinkers, secular thinkers like Dawkins, who, at one level are very anti-religious and, publish these best-selling books like The God Delusion, have suddenly realized actually that there's a far more dangerous kind of quasi-religious ideology in their own backyard of academia. People are questioning basic scientific truths, for instance, about, gender and sexuality and that kind of thing. And they're suddenly realizing, it turns out the Christian fundamentalists that I used to rail against aren't really the problem. It's some of my own secular peers. And so that's really interesting. And another example, famous example of this is Peter Boghossian, who again was one of these new atheist types. He wrote his own kind of book against religion called A Manual for Creating Atheists. I had him on my show, back in 2014, but only 4 years later, when I sort of called him up asking if he would take part in a debate against a Christian, because I was coming to his neck of the woods, Portland State University, he said, actually, I'm no longer doing those kinds of debates. This was 2018. He said, and you'll understand why soon, Justin. And what it turned out was that he was part of a conspiracy sort of hoax set of academic bogus papers that he and his co-conspirators created, kind of parodying this new sort of consensus in academia around grievance studies, critical theories around gender, race, sexuality, and so on. And he again was doing it because he believed this had kind of captured the academy and that it was creating this sort of cancel culture where only certain types of orthodoxy were allowed. So what you've effectively got is a kind of new quasi-religious views that have come into the mainstream, effectively replacing the Christian story for many people. And what you see in response is a lot of these, what were the new atheists, Dawkins, Boghossian, and so on, suddenly realizing that's now their new enemy. And it does make interesting bedfellows sometimes with Christians who perhaps stand alongside them, critiquing those kinds of movements. So yeah, a lot's changed in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, when the Judeo-Christian ethic is sort of a baseline and you have the ability to make these arguments that Dawkins and others have made because you have this social order that sort of comes from that baseline. Once that baseline starts to get thrown out and things start to get chaotic, it is interesting to watch some of these people say, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something to this. And to your point before, about the fact that maybe we're moving towards a place where Christianity might have a resurgence of some sort. As you were working on this book, putting this together, based especially on all the interviews you've done over the years, how confident are you in your belief that perhaps we are going to see this resurgence, even though it feels like quite the opposite?
Well, it's interesting because I wrote the book and I kind of had what I thought was quite a good body of evidence. A lot of these conversations I'd had with interesting secular thinkers who were pointing people back towards Christianity. I mean, as I say, not least people like Jordan Peterson, who is a bit of an enigma as a psychologist who has obviously gained a worldwide audience, especially among young men, but seems to constantly be pointing people back towards the Bible and the value of religious tradition and so on, even though it's hard to tell exactly where he stands on the whole God issue himself. But after I'd finished the book, I'd kind of sent it off to the publishers. I just kept coming across more and more of similar stories. Other people who were either very surprising converts to Christianity as adults, these secular thinking people who decided actually the Christian story seems to make better sense right now than the secular atheist story of reality. Even to only in the last few weeks, you've probably heard about this, Billy, but Ayaan Hirsi Ali is this Somali-born ex-Muslim who was very much part of the new atheist sort of set of thinkers and speakers in the mid-2000s. And she came out just a couple of weeks ago with an article saying why I am now a Christian. Essentially, she's like the paradigmatic example of what I'm describing in this book. Essentially, someone who has come to see that her atheism simply could not contend against the forces that are going on in the world. Both those kind of big forces of authoritarian regimes, Putin, China, etc., but also what she sees as this kind of woke ideology, which she sees as parasitic on culture as well. And she said, I finally got persuaded that the only thing that could stand against this was the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, again, it's interesting to know exactly where she then stands herself as a believer per se, but it seems she has gone on a spiritual journey as well, looking for that thing, and she's found it somehow in Jesus Christ. So I think this is a serious movement. And I kind of, and again, it's just pockets, just like those revival sort of things you were talking about. You only see sort of little burst happening, but I think they're like the green shoots of something that could be a bigger harvest at some point.
Yeah, when Asbury happened, I thought, okay, it's one event, right? And then there were about 5 other ones. And then you had the mass baptisms. Then you had Jesus Revolution, the film that, really sort of blew up. And it was a lot of little things that seemed to paint a bigger picture. And I'm always careful with how far I'll go with that, but it feels like something is definitely afoot. And by the way, in her article, I thought it was interesting. She mentioned at the end, that there was a personal dynamic to this too. So much of that article was about the structural, right, which is what we were talking about before, that we need the Judeo-Christian ethic. But there was a portion where she said, I'm still learning, but there is a personal draw. And I thought, gosh, what an interesting journey for her. And I think for the rest of the world to be sort of watching that, as you were saying, notable person make such an incredible journey. I have to ask you, though, because through Unbelievable, through all of your work over the years, you have heard a lot of compelling arguments both for and against faith. Obviously, you're a very strong Christian. What has it that has kept you in your faith and built your faith up, even as you've listened to some of those arguments against Christianity?
I mean, to put it in really broad terms, simple terms, I would say it's the discovery that everyone has a faith, actually. There is no neutral bystander, okay? So pretty much all the atheists and agnostics I ever encountered, well, they actually had a faith of some kind. Ironically, the fact that they were good people who believed in human rights, equality, dignity, and everything else, that didn't actually come from their atheism. It didn't come from science. It didn't come from the Enlightenment. Ironically, as I've discovered, it really comes from Christianity. And again, this is sort of part of the book, that the fact that actually we're still essentially swimming in Christian waters when it comes to people's moral instincts, their assumptions about the way life is. And I realized actually you can't get through life without sort of, in that sense, believing things that can't be proved simply through science or reason alone. You have to make a kind of a leap of faith at some point to this idea that humans have intrinsic value and dignity. It's not a scientific thing you can discover about humans. And so what I discovered was we all, as it were, have to kind of at some point sort of make that assumption or that leap of faith, if you like. I just found that the Christian story was a far more compelling account of reality in that sense than the atheist one. It made more sense of this belief in a moral universe, that humans have intrinsic worth and inviolable dignity. I didn't see how the atheist account could make sense of that belief, even though most of the atheists I met absolutely believed it. So there was that aspect of it, but it was also the historical aspect of it. Something happened 2,000 years ago. Now, people have tried to dismiss this. The Jesus mythologists have come along, but that those kind of theories are way kind of left field and really not taken seriously in academia. And whether or not you kind of take the Bible as, the inspired word of God or not, the fact is you've got a set of historical data here that you can't deny. And something really strange happened 2,000 years ago. And the best explanation I've ever heard is the one that the first followers of Jesus gave, that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. Because when you look at the things that happened because of that claim, I find it very hard to deny it. What happened in their own time, in their own lifetime, people were willing to be martyred and brutally, mistreated for the sake of, what others have said was a lie. The fact that it changed the world around them, it completely changed the civilization they were living in, and it has changed our civilization. And just all manner of other different things that for me say there's something at the center of this story that makes sense of it. So there were lots of different factors. In the end, it wasn't one argument that kept me convinced that the Christian story made best sense. It was a number of different things together. And just the fact that you also have to just hold that up against the atheist story of reality. Everyone's got a worldview in that sense. And I just didn't find the atheist worldview as compelling or as plausible as the Christian one. So those were just a few of the reasons why in the end I said, no, this makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, even the archaeological evidence that is coming out of Israel now, right? We're watching all of these things that continue to back up what we see in Scripture, events, locations, even various technologies of the time and products of the time that we see coming forth. Even the news. You watch the news, and of course, this is a powder keg, so I'll be careful how far I go with it. But nations that we're watching in the headlines being the very nations that are discussed in Scripture or even speculated about in prophecy. And so there's so much there, I think, on top of that. But before we go here, I want to ask you, you obviously have the book. Again, the title is A Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and people need to grab that book and check it out, especially people concerned about culture. I think a lot of people are scared right now, and they're not sure what to think. And here you are presenting a really, I think, hopeful case for faith, but also your podcast. Tell us a little bit about the podcast, and where people can listen?
Well, the podcast is also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And I'm really excited about it because in many ways it takes the book and it takes it really on a bigger journey where I speak to lots of thinkers, activists, people on both sides of the Christian atheist divide, and a lot of people who have come to faith, as adults. And it's been a really exciting thing to be able to sort of, as I say, in real time, document some of these interesting stories. People like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for instance, who we were just talking about. Because once you've written a book, it's kind of there, it's done, and that's what it is. But with a podcast, you can keep telling the story, and so that's really what I'm doing in a long form way. And it's kind of a highly produced, quite polished documentary style podcast. So I think I'm trying to really take people on a journey to kind of make sense of what's happened in the last 20, 25 years when it comes to atheism, Christianity, the conversation on God, the way that picture has changed significantly, and some of the exciting things going on now that suggest to me that, yeah, God's still alive, God's still up to something. And it's not the end of the story for the church. We live in a quite a cynical age, even in Christian circles, Billy, where people, kind of get kind of disillusioned and cynical about the church, sometimes for good reason. But I believe God's not finished with the church, and we may just be standing on the edge of something like the next great revival. I mean, I'm not kind of going to say I'm a great, prophesier of these things, but I do feel like something is stirring, something's happening, and yeah, I've great hope that God is not finished yet.
I love that you said that. And I will add, depending on where people fall theologically, some people will say, well, how could that be? Because, everything that, in eschatology points to the earth getting worse and things getting worse. Yeah, even if you hold to that theological viewpoint, you can still have revival at the same time that the general culture is moving in that direction. And so I think that's an important thing for people to remember as we look at what is happening around us, to have that hope. Justin, appreciate your time. Appreciate you joining us today. Again, the book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. The podcast goes by the same name. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on, Billy.